Hi everyone! Normally I keep videos for my students separate, but I'm going to depart from my normal history talk to put up something I'm hoping will help my own students and the other new college students who aren't quite sure how to write research papers. While most of our class materials are meant just for use by our class, this can be shared with anyone that it may help. I've noticed that many students in their first year or two of college simply don't know how to write a research paper. They were never taught, and they didn't write any papers of substantial length during high school either, so it just seems really overwhelming. I don't want to give the impression that my students don't do their best. I've had some previous students who clearly put tons and tons of work into their papers, but they were hindered by the fact that they just never learned the right way to do it, and that causes more work. So here I'm going to try to give a basic understanding of the process and the end goal. It is geared to the history discipline, though it may help with papers in other disciplines as well. I'm going to stick with some basics, so while some papers may need additional sections like historiographies or literature reviews or methodology, and there are other tricks that can be helpful for papers as well, I'm trying not to overwhelm with this video. Now, one of the skills that students have traditionally been meant to learn in college is called rhetoric. If you look that up in the dictionary, it'll say something like, rhetoric is the ability to speak and write effectively, which is true. But really, it is about the art of persuasion. When a politician persuades voters to support them in an election, or a lawyer persuades a jury to look at the evidence a certain way, or a meme on the internet persuades the viewer to think differently about a social issue. That's all rhetoric, and it's a valuable skill in life. I think people realize they're meant to learn something like this in classes like public speaking or college composition, but they don't necessarily realize that those other general education classes you're taking, the ones that kind of sometimes seem pointless, those classes should develop it as well. That's why classes like history or government or sociology or what have you might ask you to put together a paper or a project. It isn't just to learn more about the topic itself in those classes, though certainly I want that to happen as well, and it is by no means meant to just torture you. It is to further develop those skills and keep giving you ongoing practice during your time in college. But it's really hard to do that if no one explains how, right? First, let's talk about what a research paper even is. It is not a summary of a topic. Let's use the Salem witch trials as an example here and assume the assignment is a 5-page paper. A summary would spend all 5 pages talking about things like when the witch trials happened, where it happened, how many people were accused, etc. Most students are also going to include some long quotes they found in their sources and try to work those in to take up some space, following up the quotes with a sentence or two of analysis, even though the quote itself may or may not have anything to do with what they've been talking about otherwise. Then, in the conclusion paragraph, there will be some offhand comments about the long-term consequences of the Salem witch trials, how it had a long-lasting impact, yada, yada, yada. Don't do that. A research paper is a critical examination of a topic. Yes, you will include background and context information like where it happened, how many were targeted, etc. But that's just to set the stage. You should be making a case with your paper, arguing a unique perspective based on your conclusions after considering the evidence about your topic. Maybe you want to tackle the root cause of the hysteria that led to the trials. Maybe you want to talk about why women were targeted more by witch trials than men. Maybe the way they just kind of quickly ended the trials once the wrong sort of people, and by that I mean the influential sort of people, started to get accused. Focus in on something specific. Find all the evidence you can about that specific thing, and then make your argument. That's why it is so important to choose topics you find interesting, because then you can get more invested in the material and your paper will be better overall. So the first step is what? It's to look at your assignment instructions. Make sure you're aware of the criteria that your paper is supposed to meet. This can be things like the number of sources you need to use, the quality of sources, the length of the paper, though there can be other things as well, and you want to be aware of any of that up front before you put the work into your paper. Next, once you know all that, you're going to pick your topic. Now, this is something where I believe AI tools can be very helpful, especially if you're in a class where you just don't feel familiar enough to think of a topic, and extra especially in classes where your topic needs to be selected pretty early in the semester while you're sitting here thinking, like, I don't know anything about this yet. This is a perfectly legitimate and logical use of AI. For the best suggestions, you'll want to tell the AI specifics about what you're looking for. What kind of class is it? Whether your professor has put any limitations on your topic. And finally, what your particular interests are. Because remember, the more interesting the topic is to you, the better your paper will be. So then ask the AI to give you specific, narrowed topic ideas. You may not see anything that catches your eye in the first result. You can ask for more ideas. Or if there is something that sounds kind of interesting but not quite there, ask the AI to generate more ideas like that one. And of course, keep an eye out when you do the assigned readings for your class because something may jump out at you from there too. Whatever method you use, once you have that selected, then you need to pick a research question. This is strictly for your own use during research to help with brainstorming and to find what you want to focus on about your topic. But it's always good to have a working research question put in writing and then keep referring to that to keep yourself on track. Your eventual thesis statement, what you're essentially looking to prove in your paper, is the answer to this question. Once you figure out what you want to know, start looking for sources with the information needed to answer it. I'm not going to get too involved in this because different professors and different classes allow for different types of sources to be used. So again, go by the criteria in the assignment instructions you have. But whatever sources you select, I suggest keeping a running list in a document. At minimum, this should note the authors, the title, and where you found it so you can easily go back and look at it again if you need to. But preferably, the ideal scenario is you'll be keeping a running list of the actual citations for every source. So when you access a journal article, for example, click the little cite button that most databases have and copy over the citation in the style you'll be using, like APA or Chicago styles. By maintaining this list, you minimize the chance of forgetting to credit a source or being unable to find a source later when you need that information from it again. Another optional thing here is to make a few notes below each citation that you copy over to kind of remind yourself what type of information this source has in it. You'll remove those notes later. They won't be part of your final bibliography page, but it is very helpful during the research phase. Though you may be looking for a certain number of sources to meet the assignment criteria, remember that more information is good. If you don't feel the sources you found will allow you to entirely answer your research question, look for a couple more to fill in the gaps. I know it sounds like more work, but it is less work in the long run to find some more sources than it is to try to sit there and BS your way through a paper because you didn't have the evidence you needed to back up all of your points. Now, you can go in the same document as your list of sources or in a different one, whatever works for you. You can also do this next part with actual paper and pen. I find that my brain does better with paper and pen for some things and digital documents for other things, so don't be afraid to develop the process that works best for you. Anyway, in whatever form, you're going to make notes of pertinent information while you read through your selected sources. Now, key point here, make note of information in bite-sized pieces. Don't be copying over these massive 2 to 3 sentence quotes or longer. Why? Because you're doing research to come to your own conclusions and make your own argument. When you focus on these longer quotes, you are instead getting stuck in this rut in the argument that those authors are making. So your note should be focusing on the actual evidence behind it that you want to keep in mind so that you can craft your own narrative with your own conclusions. So only include longer quotes if it's something particularly well phrased that you know you want to include as a direct quote in your paper. But whether bite-sized bits of evidence or longer quotes, everything you make note of should also have a little mini citation next to it so you can remember what source this came from. Usually the author's last name and the page number is more than sufficient because you have that running list of sources to keep track of the rest of the information. But if you happen to have maybe multiple sources by the same author, also include the year published or something like that to keep it straight. This is extremely important because for academic research, you need to be able to track where all your information came from, and you want to do that right and not get it confused, because when students get the information confused and they start guessing the source that it came from, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble really quick. So once you have your research question, your sources, all the notes you've made based on your sources, step back and look at the big picture. Look at the evidence you've collected. Based on what you found, what is the answer to your research question? What is the argument you want to make in your paper? Then make a plan. I'm sure you've been told a time or two by an English teacher that you should make an outline. And it's true that outlines are extremely helpful. Though again, it's okay to come up with your own method for how that works with your brain. It doesn't have to look like a stereotypical paper outline, though the classic format is classic for a reason. The goal is you want to decide point by point how to organize and present the evidence you found. I think it's fair to say that most of us, we've probably gotten in an argument about something with someone, and then later on, the argument kind of runs back through our brain and we're like, man, I should have said this or I should have said that. Oh, this argument would have been stronger. And I want you to think like that when you plan out your paper, because that's exactly what you're doing, is you're formulating an argument as if someone else is going to disagree with you. So you need to be able to not just make your case, but you need to be able to predict and account for objections that others might have to your argument. So it's the same type of thing, even though it's in a written form. A pitfall that many students fall into is they just spend their research paper summarizing each source. So they'll have their introduction, then a paragraph or two clearly based on source 1, another paragraph or two based on source 2, so on and so forth until you get to the end. But again, when you do that, then you're focused on the arguments of each author, not your overall argument. So organize those bite-sized bits of info that I talked about based on your thoughts and go from there. So to kind of illustrate this, let's look at a visual example. Take this mosaic of Justinian and imagine each different colored tile is a different source. But they have been arranged by the artist to tell the story the artist wants to tell without reference to whatever the maker of the original tiles intended. That's the goal here. But this pitfall that I described, this issue of just summarizing source by source, that would look more like this. And for a bathroom, we can consider it pretty, depending on your taste, but that's just not the goal here with a research paper. So you want it to be something that is clearly more intentionally crafted with your own arguments and not looking like, all right, source 1, source 2, source 3. We don't want that. I'm not going to get too far into the writing part here and what it should look like, because if you've done everything I suggested up to this point, the writing should come together fairly easily for you. If there is a template or a style guide that has been made available to you, keep those open in another window so you can reference them easily. If you want to just be in the zone while writing, you don't have to get the formatting or the citations perfect while typing up your draft, but you should include some sort of draft citations as you go along, because again, we don't want to risk mixing up sources or failing to cite something. I do strongly suggest that you save writing your introduction for last, though. Many developing writers struggle with what to say in an introduction because they don't have their paper thoroughly planned out to the letter quite yet. And sure, we can try to encourage students to improve their planning stage, and you should, but a lot of this comes with time and experience. So instead, students waste a lot of time staring at the screen and end up with an introduction that, it does introduce their overall topic, but it doesn't necessarily represent the points they're going to end up making about that topic. Instead, just make sure you have a working thesis statement. Remember, that's your answer to your research question. Have that thesis statement in mind to keep your writing focused, and then write everything else first. Some disciplines have what's called a literature review that should be included after the introduction, and history's version of that is called a historiography. Some other cases may require other sections, follow whatever instructions you've been given, but you're going to write the body of the paper with whatever sections those may be, then the conclusion tying everything together again, and once you've done all that, go back and write your introduction. It'll go much quicker now that you know exactly what your paper ends up discussing, and a lot of the time it will be a much stronger introduction as well. I can always tell when I'm grading papers which students knew what they intended to write about and which students were just winging it. As it happens, AI-generated introductions also tend to sound more like students just winging it because it's very general, though I'm sure they sound great to those who don't know any better. A couple of thesis statement tips before I move on. Your thesis statement is not a summary of the different things you'll talk about. Your introduction does this, but the thesis is special and it should stand out within the introduction. The thesis statement picks a stance. You aren't just providing facts in your paper. You're providing facts that mean something. You're weaving them into one narrative. So tell your reader what those facts will prove. Let them know what to expect from reading your paper. Remember also to be specific. You should be narrowing in on a specific claim that can be adequately discussed and your point proven in the allotted number of pages. If your thesis is weak or vague, your paper probably is too, because you didn't really know what you were claiming. And on the other hand, if you claim more than you can prove, your reader will be understandably disappointed when they finish reading and you never delivered what you promised. Fundamentally, and I've said this before, remember that a thesis statement is answering a question. The research question I mentioned back when you were picking a topic, so this all goes together. Your reader doesn't need to know what that question was exactly, but everything you mention in your paper should be part of answering the question for yourself and proving the thesis statement you've presented. The last suggestion I'm going to make for the writing phase is to read your drafts out loud, especially the final draft when you think you're practically done with the paper. Our brains naturally jump over typos, duplicate words, awkward phrasing, and the like. By reading it out loud, you increase the chance of your brain and your ears catching those mistakes so that you can fix them. Finally, as a sort of overarching bit of advice for this entire process, most students are afraid to make claims in their papers because they don't feel they know enough about the topic. After all, they are first or second year undergrads, not someone who has made it their life's work. That's fair, and I get it. But I want to encourage you to embrace a Miss Frizzle type approach. Take chances, make mistakes, and get messy. If you think an event is a massacre, call it a massacre and say why. If you think a source was biased, explain where you think they strayed. If you think something had a different type of impact than what is usually attributed to it, make your case. That's the whole point of this exercise, of this writing a research paper. It's critical thinking, not robotically regurgitating the same old standard information. I hope this was helpful to you, and good luck with your research paper.